Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we dissect and analyze the cool, the epic, the cunning power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power to supercharge our everyday lives. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin. We are on episode 2 of the Cunning Semantic Campaign.
All I'm saying, if you look at the word cunning, there's a lot of good elements to it. If you think about the word as definitionally using your skills in a strategic and smart way to get a goal, everyone should want to be cunning. That's all I'm saying. Justice for the word cunning. If you're a bad guy and you're using cunning for bad reasons, I don't think that has anything to do with the word. Anyways, totally off topic though. Kev, you and I grew up in very different places. I grew up in Toronto, Canada, greatest city in the world. You grew up in Qingdao, China, the home of the greatest beer in the world, Qingdao beer.
Yes.
We grew up on a lot of really different television. I'm looking back to the olden days, growing up on superhero cartoons, like one of the best cartoons ever made, Batman the Animated Series. Growing up on the heyday of Disney Channel, watching shows like Wizards of Waverly Place, which is still one of the best TV shows ever made. Come fight me about that. That's So Raven. Sweet Life of Zack and Cody. Some of the iconic Disney Channel shows. Boy Meets World, which is, honest to God, if you haven't watched it, I don't care how old you are, watch Boy Meets World start to finish, change your life. And I grew up on those shows. And Kev, you were on Tom and Jerry, things like that. Tell me about your shows growing up.
Yeah, I remember having a lot of international cartoons or animation. There was Tom and Jerry, obviously, which is still an internet sensation today in China. People make memes about it all the time. And there's, of course, a lot of exposure to the Japanese comic, manga, anime. I watched a bunch of Digimon, Pokemon, and obviously a lot of other people closely follow stuff like One Piece. To this day, is huge. With so many of the cartoons that we got exposure to growing up, a lot of things that people remember are the messages and the lessons that really stick around with them even after they grow up. People would hear the theme songs and they would sing along and shout out the messages or classic lines from the shows together. So yeah, there's a lot more that convey through these children's shows than just entertainment at the time.
You bring up a really good point there about theme songs. Because, if I listen to some of these old theme songs, like the old Kim Possible theme song, like I feel it very viscerally. Like you feel it. There's such a strong nostalgia part of rewatching kids' TV shows because it's such a core part of your childhood. You're at such a young and impressionable age that, like I said, it teaches you a lot. It becomes such a pure and enjoyable part of your childhood before you grow up and kind of deal with the realities of the world. And we've talked about this before on the show. This is such an important responsibility. And there are very few shows that have taken that responsibility as seriously and innovated in this space as the over 50-year-old show Sesame Street. Sesame Street, I personally didn't watch a lot as a kid, and I know you didn't either, Kev. But Sesame Street is truly a groundbreaking show. It involves puppetry, it involves animation, it's music, it involves live action. And it's a show that led the way to shows that I grew up on and taught me a lot, like Bill Nye the Science Guy. Like, it led the way because it taught the world that, hey, you can create an educational television show that kids will want to watch, that can actually help kids grow and become smarter. It is a show that has a history of scientific exploration, using scientific methods to find the best way to teach kids. It's a show that the government has actively funded, really helped get off the ground because the team was able to show the government, hey, this is going to help our kids. It is a show that was rooted in a history of trying to help inner city kids and the less fortunate kids. And it is a show that has spanned to many countries even. And this week on the show, we have someone really amazing. We have Natasha Lance Rogoff, who was one of the key architects to bringing Sesame Street to Russia at the fall of the USSR. She has an incredible story that involves partnering with the US government, a young Joe Biden, working with Russian oligarchs and billionaires and creatives in a very volatile space, and trying to figure out what does a Russian Sesame Street look like to a post-USSR Russia that hasn't really found their image themselves yet. It's an amazing story. She wrote a book about it called Muppets in Moscow, and we are so excited to get to dive deep into this with her and learn some of these cultural differences in storytelling, learn about her journey educating kids and this immense responsibility of using entertainment and storytelling to teach kids lessons.
So without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Natasha. So Natasha, to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
My story is that I got pulled in to executive produce Sesame Street in Russia without any children's television experience. And it was an incredible wild ride, which is why I wanted to write the book, the Muppets in Moscow book, because I just thought it really had to be told. But my background is as a TV producer, journalist, and I made documentaries in what was then the Soviet Union in the 1980s and also in the early 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Empire. So I moved to what was then the Soviet Empire in the early 1980s when I was 22 years old and just fell in love with Russian culture, the people, and spent a good part of my youth there, working there.
This story is so incredible, and I think one of my favorite things about doing the show is that we get to explore so many neat stories and go into kind of rabbit holes. Kevin and I are both immigrants. Kevin's from China, from Canada. And I started diving a little bit deeper into the history of the Muppets and Sesame Street in America. And it's so fascinating.
Yeah, I listened to some of your podcasts and congratulations on, the breadth of what you're doing. And
Thank you.
I love
Thank
that
you.
you're exploring storytelling from, so many diverse angles, both in terms of like how it affects mental health and, all kinds of aspects. So wonderful podcast. And thank you for having me on.
Oh, that means so much
We
to us.
appreciate
We
that.
were we were so nervous about you too, because like your story is amazing. Like you've
Yeah.
been through so much and you've done so many really cool things. Um,
All an accident. Let me put it that way. One accident leading to another accident.
You know what? That's amazing too, because that's the thing we learned very quick about the show is the reason we start off with what's your story is because it tells us a lot about the storyteller based on how they answer that question. And every single person's like accident, totally weird winding path, not the one I planned. And that's something we love to talk about because I think it's a story we tell ourselves when we get so trapped in like this is what our life has to look like. So when we hear from people that inspire us and they're like we're just trying to figure out life, that's the best thing, when people are
Yeah.
just honest about it.
The other thing about it is that, I remember, being a teenager and seeing films. And at that point, the way the films made me feel, I knew I wanted to be part of that. That it was like this heightened reality for you emotionally, and that you could get that from something that was a flat screen. It was remarkable, just like theater, that you could suddenly be suspended into this other place through words. So, I mean, that's definitely something that, motivated me my whole life, I think.
Amazing. I mean, yeah, exactly. It's one of the huge parts of reasons we started this show. The power of storytelling is unbelievable. And kind of reading about the story of Sesame Street and the Muppets and this idea of Joan Gaines Goonie bringing the show as a way to educate children, and it has such roots in activism. I did not realize that
Mhm.
Sesame Street has such an impactful history of pushing and fighting for educating our children. And we had a guest on the show named Kevin Burke, and he's an Emmy-nominated writer, executive producer of the Spider-Man animated television show and different Marvel superhero animated television show. And he talked about the immense responsibility of writing for children about socializing them to important topics, teaching them how to deal with things like grief and responsibility and really real issues as a child through the lens of their heroes. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that responsibility was like for you coming into this brand new world that you had never entered before with children's writing, and how you felt about that and how you approached that?
I think about that a lot today, also in the context of where we were 30 years ago and where we are today. I'm aware of what's happening in Russia now with young children. There have been a number of articles about the requirements that the Kremlin has for teachers in terms of what they say about the war to young, kindergartners, third graders, and that their language has to be, supportive of the war and critical of the West. And so I think a lot about, when we first went to what was then, post Soviet Union, and we were working with a team of 400 artists, puppeteers, writers, filmmakers, set designers, as well as education experts from all over the former Soviet Union. And the first step that we took in creating the show was to assemble a group of these people, our team and the education research team, and discuss what did they want to teach their children? What were the goals of the show going to be? And it was a period of intense instability, in the country. This is, imagine a superpower that's just collapsed, and you have all these parts of your country that are splitting off and becoming independent countries like Ukraine and Armenia and Georgia. It's like you're one unit, and suddenly you feel like, you're disembodied because parts of you are going all over the place. And yet, from the perspective of the former republics, they had long wanted independence. So they had a different perspective. And our show had to represent all of these people because the show was going to be broadcast across 11 time zones, 1/7 of the world's surface. So we had a real sense of our responsibility. And for my colleagues who were Russian, Ukrainian, Armenian, all working together, for them it was really challenging to think about how we were going to write stories. And one of the physicists that was at this early meeting, he said to the research director, Charlotte Cole, who was, the American head of American Sesame Street Research International, and he said, I don't know if I'm going to stay for this meeting because you're tasking us with coming up with the content for this new television show, and it's supposed to reflect an open society, but we don't know what an open society looks like. So, how are we supposed to create content for it? And I remember, I was overhearing this, and I was just like, God, this is so sad, and he's absolutely right. What does it look like? How are we going to translate a lot of these ideas about tolerance, freedom of expression, teaching children that it's okay to make mistakes, and not following rules is part of the exploration of childhood. So I think the team very much understood the responsibility they had in the context of this enormous historical change.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people miss this too if you don't do research into Sesame Street. But how many experts are involved in the creation of the initial show and when you enter new worlds, it's a lot of it's the show's history is rooted in education, right? It's rooted in finding the best ways to teach things to children. Um, why do you think it's so important that you bring in experts that you talk about? Because I think a lot of people will be like, oh, it's just writing an interesting way to tell the alphabet, right? Why is it so important that you root in education and experts in the storytelling process?
This was not anything that originated with me. It was the policy and approach of Sesame Street developed years earlier. I was born in 1960. So Sesame Street aired for the first time in 1968, 69, I think. And it was a nonprofit company. And as you said, incredibly revolutionary. I wouldn't be here today talking about Sesame Street in Russia if it had not been for Joan Gance Cooney, who had the incredibly brilliant visionary idea of using television in this way and bringing in researchers so that the educational content was grounded in some type of scientific basis, and used the growing body of children's educational knowledge that was exploding in the 1960s. The country had moved, and quite a bit had changed by that time in terms of ideas of um, a more open teaching approach too. I'm a child of the 1970s. I remember open schools where we had, the desks were all in like a giant room, and we didn't have any walls. It was a period of enormous transition in education, the educational approach. Um, and I think many companies today, Disney and other companies, have adopted the same principles. Um, that the use of educators to think about the responsibility of the show is quite possibly today more standard fare compared to the 1960s, 70s, I would say.
Definitely quite amazing the amount of thoughts and work behind what seems to be just very simple children TV programs that
Yeah.
um,
I mean,
you,
Kevin, we use that. I mean, one of the most amazing places where it was used was in the audition process
mhm.
of Sesame Street in Russia, Ulitsa Sezam, which is how you say the name of the show in Russian. And we auditioned about 600 children, so their mothers were there, and they were very much like stage mothers in the U.S. too, equally as anxious. And mostly it was mostly mothers. There were almost no fathers there. And when we first uh, auditioned, the children, they were in separate rooms, so they didn't hear what the other children were performing. And with the first child that came up, he started singing this World War II song, about uh, it went something like, the planet is burning, everything is lost. And I was listening to this, and I thought, this is very strange for a comedy children's show to pick this song. And then he left, and then the next girl came in, and she also sang a song from World War II called Katusha, which was about a woman bidding her lover goodbye as he went off to the front. And when I asked the director about this, chief director, I said, what is it with this? Like I was kind of expecting, Old MacDonald's Had a Farm or Itsy Bitsy Spider. Um, and he said, Natasha, these songs aren't sad, they're lyrical. And, we went on to have this very long discussion about the music, which eventually he wanted to make a, leitmotif of the show, like these kind of sad, just melancholy ballads. And I was thought, wow, this is so different from, Sesame Street in the States. So eventually we had to I brought this whole conundrum to the research director, the Russian research director, Dr. Genina. And I said, I don't know how to handle this, And she said, well, why don't we test the segments? So they used the Sesame Street approach where they tested these lyrical segments with about 1,200 children in different regions, and they use the method of eyes on screen testing. to evaluate efficacy of teaching as well as attention. And one of the videos that she had collected, and there were several like this, when the lyrical segments came on, a little boy picked up a pistol and shot at the girl sitting next to him with the braids, and then he walked away from the TV. So we showed that to the chief director, and he was like, "Okay, maybe we won't make any more of these, you know." But it was research that showed that. I mean, I wasn't involved in it other than saying, could we use research in some way, because I had a hunch that Russia was changing, and we had all these young musicians who were composing absolutely brilliant music for the new show, and it seemed like we should take advantage of that, to make the show popular and better and deeper, like a new vision of what Russia could be.
I'm glad you bring up the music, because the music is one of the most important parts of Sesame Street, and it's something you talk a lot about in your book. And I know you talked about first approaching that element of the show, like almost every element of the show, it sounds like, was a fight, because you bring in all these.
Not every element.
Not
Not
every,
every element.
I mean, it's such an interesting cultural divide, because you bring in the immense history of Sesame Street, working with different artists like Johnny Cash, and working with songs based on Beatles, and working with so many different artists, when bringing it to the creative team and talking about how do we incorporate music. And there's a lot of push to lean into the Russian amazing tradition of operatic and classicalness. And then I know you have a unique history with Russian music as well, with underground rock scene and things like that. Can you talk to us a little bit about those conversations, about one, impressing how important music is to this show, and two, finding that healthy median of how do I bring in the history of Sesame Street while respecting Russian tradition and get people excited about the musical elements of this show?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, music is definitely a theme that runs throughout the entire book. Um, and, that's not surprising. I had come into producing this with as I said, the hope of bringing in many musicians who had been denied opportunity under communism. But pretty much from the beginning, our chief director of music, who was a very well known composer herself and trained in the Moscow conservatories, and her perspective was that um, the music should be classical music, Russian classical music entirely. And I understood where she was coming from, because Russian animation, which is world renowned, absolutely beautiful, soulful, cell animation, often had classical music as its background. So that was familiar to her. And I found this theme over and over again, as we were talking about change to something that was new and different, that this was a very difficult period for many Soviet citizens. And, often there was a push, and this was even said by the head director at the time, that, this is a time of enormous instability, and children need things. They need to see things that are familiar, that, will give them comfort. And those songs that we were talking about earlier, the what I called sad songs, what the chief director called lyrical songs, he said that these are the songs that young children sing with their grandmothers, that these songs bring them comfort. And so it was very important in the context of, the discussion of the creation of music for this new show, that all of these perspectives were taken into consideration. And then to see where we could find a new way. How could we incorporate elements from the past and integrate them with new music, that would represent a new society that was changing at a breakneck pace. this discussion went on for months, and the only thing that changed the music director's point of view was finally meeting with some of the young musicians and finding a common language, realizing that they shared a lot in common, that even the rock musicians were educated in traditional music, and they often wanted to use elements of Russian folklore and military ballads from the Soviet Union too, juxtaposing them. There were, for example, there's this song about glory to peace kind of song, a Soviet song, and they used the tune and they made it glory to porridge. It was so it was absolutely perfect. And there were many examples like that, where similar to Sesame Street, where the comedy was on two levels for the parents and the children. The Russian team, so brilliant, artistic geniuses, would come up with their own interpretation of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, the music in both versions of the show, I mean, is beautiful. I know I was listening to, I think it's the Work People song. I don't know what it's actually called in Russian, but uh, I forget what was happening, but it was about like in the mornings, the people who go to work and work on the street, and the sweepers and the bus drivers. And it was such a beautiful song. I only read the subtitles, but I think the music in these shows is beautiful and such a great educational tool.
Many people who've heard the music of the first season of Ulitsa Sezam, they say, it's as good as the first season of Sesame Street in the United States. I believe it. I mean, we
Yeah.
had such a talented team working on it, mostly because at that time the film studios were dark. Television was not being produced, except other than political content, because the Russian government didn't have money for that. So we were able to bring into our team, the top cinematographers and the top directors for children's films, as well as from theater. So it was an absolutely phenomenal team.
When it comes to TV shows being exported into a different market, what we often see is, for example, cartoons. They show the original stuff, but they only dub it into the local language. For me, growing up in China, I had exposure to a lot of anime, and what they do is they simply have the Mandarin voiceover. So, what went into the decision for Sesame Street to co-produce these localized content in, I think, almost every country that it arrives to?
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning, when Sesame Street was, working with local state broadcasters in other countries, and the first was probably Mexico, I think, with Plaza Sesamo, and I worked on that show. I speak Spanish as well, and so there was really an initial idea. Obviously, it would be much easier to just dub a show, like the shows that you were exposed to in China. It's cheaper. You can make more money because you're not paying production costs, obviously. But that wasn't what Sesame Street was about. The idea was what you said at the beginning of the show, which is it was a social justice mission. And, the idea was to transfer skills and experiences to children that are based on their own culture and values, so that they can, live full lives with opportunity. And so, a certain percentage of the show was certainly dubbed. In the case of the Russian series, it was about 40%, and it was only live action films and animated segments and Muppet segments. So where there were only Muppets in the pieces, and those were then dubbed with expert voiceover actors, where it was so important to me personally to find voices that actually sounded like Ernie and Bert, and that was really fun to find people who could do that, actors. um, but the approach was always to make a genuinely original program that could be popular in that society. And for instance, in the case of Ulitsa Sezam, its success is a testament to this approach, because the show that we started in 1996, it went on for, subsequent seasons for the next 10 years and well into Putin's era. And I meet people in Russia. I was there in January of 2020, the last time before the pandemic hit. And as well as, I meet people, Georgians, Ukrainians, Russians, people all over the world who, when I ask them, if they happen to know Ulitsa Sezam, and they'll usually like break into song or tell me who their favorite Muppets are and talk about how, oh, I grew up on that show. I love the Muppets. I love Zeli Boba. He's the full body puppet.
Yeah, and of course, one of the, I think, most vivid stories I remember from that book is also kind of related to this shared memory of Sesame Street. Is when you and the Russian team first came to New York City, and you ran into this very enthusiastic group of African American teenagers, and they pointed out that on the jacket you were wearing at the time were Bert and Ernie, and that was like a moment of connection, but it also made your Russian team realize the impact it already has and the potential impact it could have of the show they're producing.
Yeah, no, that was an incredible day, and it took months. I mean, the whole design and creation of the Slavic Muppets, almost caused World War III. And that was the day that everything changed. And I am so grateful to that group of teenagers because, I just was like, they just didn't want the Muppets. They were like, we have our own strong traditions, puppetry traditions revered, which they do with the Abratsov puppetry tradition, going back to the 16th century. And then they saw these kids, that were just standing there reciting their favorite episodes and segments, and they just got it. They were like, wow, this show can have such a huge impact, in our country. We could be part of that. We can make a change.
I think it's such a good concept and abstract example of the power of storytelling, especially children's storytelling, because it becomes such a pure and important part of yourself that even as you age, that's such a pure time in your life, and it's such an exciting thing where the value of strong IP, strong stories, makes you loyal to that. It makes you excited about that. So when you run into people who are like, doesn't matter how old they are, like Sesame Street's a part of me. It's a brand. I learned so much from Big Bird, right? That's exciting, and you can see the authenticity and the excitement in the face, and it can truly change
Yeah.
minds. Right? It's such a key example, something we love talking about on the
And
show.
also that they were the people that were going to design the Muppets. That was the team that was going to head up all the writers, the local writers that were going to write original content. And it was in that moment they got this idea. Oh my God, this is such an opportunity. Before that, it was like pulling teeth. It was like,
I mean, you can preach it as much as you possible until you're blue in the face, until they see it, until they see this is the impact it can have on someone. It's a totally different
yeah.
conversation.
Well, I think also they came to the Sesame Street set in Queens and in New York, and they met the puppeteers, and that also made it real. I'm sure in a society, when you have ideology which is, shoved down your throat, for 70 years, and we have our own problem with that here as well. But when you have that, happen, you're quite skeptical of a lot of things, and rightly so. So it had to be an emotional experiences that shifted that discussion.
Mhm. I think one idea we keep touching upon during this conversation is kind of the tug of war between the past and the future, and the tradition
Yes.
versus the change, and of course, the differences between the American culture and the Russian culture, both kind of traditionally and contemporary to that time. So I wanted to get a little bit more into that because I know that you have had very up close personal experience with both societies and cultures. So for you, what do you see are some of the major differences between America and Russia in terms of the styles of storytelling?
Well, since this is a podcast about storytelling, I think the best way to describe this is to tell a story. I'll describe the origin story of one script, which was supposed to teach children about the concept of happy versus sad. And I don't know if you remember this in the book, but it was one of many explanations of stories. The one first example is initial scripts were quite depressing that were submitted, and in Russian literature, there's a theme of sadness, and everybody knows the famous quote by Tolstoy. But anyway, one of the early scripts submitted wanted to teach the letter D for depression, for example. And I thought, well, let's have a conversation about that. And but this particular script was about a little boy and a little girl who were holding a balloon, and they're playing in a park and just taking a walk, and the little boy accidentally lets go of his balloon. The little girl looks at him, and he starts crying, and she then lets go of her balloon, and the two of them, the two children, stand holding hands, watching the balloons go up into the sky together. And when I read the script, I turned to the writing team and I said, I don't understand. Why don't they just share the other balloon? And they laughed at me and they said, that's a very American perspective. They say they're both happy. They are appreciating the beauty of seeing their balloons go up into the sky together. And I thought that was a quintessential moment of differences between our culture. And in the book, there are many examples like that capture differences. And I think about that today in the context of themes that repeat themselves from the 1990s. Putin uses the 1990s as a narrative to justify his authoritarianism and the war today. And that's why it's so important for us also to understand what happened in the 1990s. But there are also themes that we experienced through the prism of the Muppets that I see repeated again. Themes of Russian national pride, how the West is trying to destroy Russia, the superiority of Russian culture to Western culture. Russian culture is more soulful than American culture. There are all sorts of these examples that come up again and again and reverberate through our relationship with Russia. And it's very important for us to understand these differences in the hopes of having peace.
What a story.
Seriously, what a story. This book, like Muppets in Moscow. We're going to talk about it in the intro too, don't worry. But I highly recommend reading. It's incredible. The Sesame Street's involved, history involved. Somehow Joe Biden's involved. Like, this is an incredible story.
To close out our episode, we have this segment called Suspenders. We ask you a fun, random question unrelated to anything whatsoever. You can give us any random answer you feel like. Question of the day is, if you were to get a tattoo today, what would you get?
That is totally random. Well, I have to say, I would not be getting a tattoo. So, but not at this stage, I don't think. What tattoo would I get? Oh God, now I have to really think about it. I guess I would probably design a flower out of my children's names.
That's great. No, I love that. I think for me, mine would be easy. I keep hinting, but I'm never gonna do it because I'd be too anxious. And my
We
mom
both
would
be disowned, yeah.
But if I was to get a tattoo,
What would you
oh
do?
yeah, I would get like a maple leaf right
A
here.
maple leaf. There's a whole thing
Very
in
Canadian.
Muppets in Moscow. There's a whole section about oak leaves and the difference between Russian and American oak leaves. So I'm now curious about what the maple leaf means.
Oh, it's just Canadian. I'm
Oh,
Canadian.
okay.
So just like the Canadian maple
I
leaf.
guess.
That would be the one I would get if I were to get. Don't worry, Mom, I'm not getting a tattoo.
Well, this was lovely. So thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with you guys.
Thank you.
I mean, we are so grateful for your
It's
time.
very sweet.
This story was amazing. This book was amazing. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze some of the really interesting storytelling lessons we got from this week's expert storyteller. And this week we had someone truly, truly amazing who's had an amazing journey, who's made a huge impact on the world, Natasha Lance Rogoff. Kev, how amazing was it after reading her really epic book, Muppets in Moscow, to actually talk to her and hear from her some of these really cool things she's experienced?
I mean, what a story. And this book obviously has so much, as the title said, unexpected, crazy, true stories. And we actually get to pull behind the curtains of the creation of Sesame Street. You know, it's very informative and educational conversation just to learn about how this show is created.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think was so important is this idea of curiosity. Curiosity is something we've been exploring a lot this season, and its role in how it affects storytelling and how important curiosity is to learning about the world. Something that from the very early days of the original Sesame Street and the early days of Ulitsa Sezam, the Russian Sesame Street, was the importance of educational research. We talked with Natasha about this, about how important it was to be curious about how children learn, curious about what Russian children like versus American children, curious about ways they could tell effective stories to children. Because I think a lot of times the mistake people make when they try to educate with children is they're like, oh, we were children, we know how children work. But something Sesame Street and Ulitsa Sezam did really well was they took a step back and said, let's discover, let's ask questions, let's be curious, let's do actual educational research to learn how to tell stories to children and find ways to connect to them. And that's what made the show so successful, was that they didn't talk down to their audience. They took a step back and they approached it with curiosity. That was the secret sauce for the show, and it's a secret sauce for any form of storytelling you're doing with any audience. Don't think you know best. Don't talk down to them. Be curious about them and then create it around that.
Yeah, so it's that mutual understanding that is the premise of storytelling, that is the end goal of storytelling as well. You know, we kind of talked about the story where the same story about the children and the balloon, and how Natasha, the American, and the Russian producers had very different understanding of the messages in that story. And those are the little details that were instrumental to creating Ulitsa Sezam and making it a very popular story.
Yeah, and I think innovation is the last key lesson from this amazing story, was how important it is to innovate the types of storytelling you're doing. Sesame Street was all about innovation, bringing in puppets, bringing in music, bringing in animation, and finding ways to keep innovating. With Russian Sesame Street, Natasha had to keep innovating. It wasn't just like, oh, let's take all the Sesame Street innovations. Like, okay, how do we innovate this for Russian culture? How do we reapproach creating puppets for Russian culture? How do we reapproach creating music for Russian culture? By innovating, she was able to create a better story, creating a story that was more real to the culture. So I think this story is amazing because it talks about 3 key parts of storytelling that you can use in whether you're pitching, whether you're selling a product, Be curious, be authentic, and innovate. I'm Gaurav.
I'm Kevin. This has been another great episode of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. If you like our content, make sure to subscribe and follow wherever you listen. Leave us a comment and review to let us know what you're thinking. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at LSPGPod.
You're taking the time to become a better storyteller, which is going to help you in ways you can't even imagine at this point. So keep listening, keep letting us know what you think. We love you. Have a great one.